I 2016 blev Bob Dylan tildelt Nobelprisen i litteratur. Det var en verdenssensation, og jeg var utrolig glad, for jeg havde jo indstillet Bob Dylan til Nobelprisen i litteratur i mange år, så det var en stor dag for mig. Og den dag, der lovede jeg mig selv 2 ting. At jeg ville skrive en bog om Bob Dylans digtning, og at jeg ville indbyde til en international konference her på Syddansk Universitet. Og ja, nu er bogen her, og konferencen er lige på vej til at gå i gang. De internationale gæster er på vej hertil, og vi er her på Syddansk Universitet i Odense centrum i det adelige Jomfrukloster. Og lige om lidt så kommer vores gæster, og vi kan byde velkommen til Dr. Michael Gray, som er en af gæsterne. Michael Gray, you are the author of the first critical study of Bob Dylan's art, Song and Dance Man, The Art of Bob Dylan, that first appeared in 1972, and it has been reprinted, and you've done job on, you've worked on it several times afterwards.
Yes.
This is an amazing book. What is your focus in this book on the study of the art of Bob Dylan?
I think words.
Words.
And also, the thing is, I grew up with loving words and loving rock and roll. And therefore, for me, Bob Dylan was the most extraordinary person to come along. Because before him, everyone in popular music relied on songwriters, or they were writing very simple stuff, you know. The Beatles, melodically very interesting, but not in terms of words. And nobody was really writing political songs in the mainstream. Yes, in the folk movement, in the folk revival, yes, but I wasn't aware of that. As I was growing up, I grew up on Merseyside, across the river from Liverpool, and so the Beatles were a local group to me, and so I rather took them for granted anyway. But when I was a student reading English literature, I was, you know, being trained to scrutinize the text of 19th century novels and so on and so on. And I loved it. And I was hearing this extraordinary young American.
How did you come across him?
When did you first, I think on the radio, first of all, people, times there are changing.
That was in the 60s?
Yeah, oh yes, yes, I'm talking about this early 60s, really. And in the early 60s, on mainstream pop radio, Bob Dylan punctured this only really with Times They Are Changing, to start with. And then more or less simultaneously with Subterranean Homesick Blues, although they hadn't been created almost simultaneously. As you know, that was a 2-year gap. But Times They Are Changing, what struck me when I first heard it on pop radio was the voice. But then when I went to university, which I did in 1964, which was a good time to start being a student, I have to say. I met another English student of English literature. Her name was Linda, and I found her very attractive. And so I listened to what she said about music. I was still full of Elvis Presley and Little Richard and Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, but also more recent people like Roy Orbison.
The relationship that he's created.
Then you also discovered that Dylan belonged to a tradition of literature and art, of poetry, of famous poets.
Eventually I did, yes. But to start with, I was listening to this girl, Linda, and she said, well, you know, there is someone on a whole other level from Elvis Presley. He doesn't just sing, and he writes his own songs, and his name is Bob Dylan. And she lent me an album, and the album was another side of Bob Dylan, which was the newest album in 1964.
64.
And I found it very hard to cope with his voice to start with, because I'd never been to a folk club, I wasn't trained in that way, and my inclination was not that way. Not that I wanted everyone to have a smooth voice, Little Richard did not, but a beautifully controlled voice. Bob Dylan's was very different. But then I listened, and somehow a kind of hook dropped into me, and that was it. And yes, I was listening to this extraordinary volume of songs, long, complicated songs, and also short, complicated songs.
Yeah.
And I felt that some of them certainly could bear the weight of the same kind of critical scrutiny that I was being taught to bring to bear to conventional literature.
Yeah, and so you combined your interest in Bob Dylan with your study of English literature?
Yes, absolutely, yes, yes. And so I was continually amazed by how fast he changed and so on. And I started to want to write about him. And the only way you could write at length would be to write a book.
You called your book Song and Dance Man. Could you comment on that title? Why did you pick that one?
Because people were asking him. By 1965, people were there's a press conference in San Francisco in late 1965 with Allen Ginsberg is there. And he is asked if he thinks of himself as a poet, and he says, I think of myself as just a song and dance man. So in the preface, on the first page of my book, I put, I think of myself as just a song and dance man, Bob Dylan, 1965, and underneath, never trust the artist, trust the tale, D.H. Lawrence, 1924. Yeah,
excellent. That's an interpretation, not an explanation, I think, of this. You're also the author of the Bob Dylan Encyclopedia.
Yes.
An enormous book, so impressive, and it's simply a must for everyone who's interested in Bob Dylan. You have to have this book, because you can look up so many things, so many information you find in this wonderful edition. But it must have been a very hard work to write this book.
Well, yes, when I look at it now, I'm amazed at how I managed it, really, because it really was done quite quickly. I mean, really only 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Whereas Song and Dance Man 3, the third and final edition of Song and Dance Man, had taken me more or less the whole of the 1990s. But you know, even the encyclopedia, even the updated version is now 10 years old. So,
you're right,
so there's a lot of stuff people can't find in that book.
But a lot of useful information, I should say. And what was the most amusing thing that you came across when you worked with this encyclopedia?
I think the most extraordinary thing, which I think I knew anyway, was the amazing way that he has kept his private life so private. You know, he's been a public figure. He's been famous for 55 years. And yet, you know, whereas we know, or think we know, everything about, you know, D.H. Lawrence or F. Scott Fitzgerald, we know very, very little. In a media-greedy age, we know so little about Bob Dylan, as for amusing, well, you know, he has a very acid wit, and there are many stories about him that I like for their cruel humour, if you like.
What is your favorite?
Well, I like, for example, when the manager of Led Zeppelin, Peter Grant, bumped into Bob Dylan in somewhere, and in the 1980s, And he came up to Bob and he said, excuse me, I just wanted to say hello. My name's Peter Grant. I'm the manager of Led Zeppelin. And Bob said, do I tell you my problems?
Yeah, that's humor. But why do you think that he has been able to keep this privacy? Because I think you're quite right about this. We know actually little on the private person Bob Dylan. How did he manage to do that? He's world famous. Everybody all over the world, you can find people who listen to his music and know all about him. But yet we know so little.
Yeah, I think it's sort of heavy management.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know. But you know, he's had a very long-term relationship with the guy who runs his office.
Yeah.
And I think, well, for one thing, you know, most people who want something from him have to go through this guy.
Yeah, through Jeff Rosen, who is the manager of Bob
Jeff
Dylan.
Rosen,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also I think that there's a lot of the media that actually hasn't been very interested in him since the 1960s. You know, I was in a taxi going to New York once to see Bob Dylan at the Beacon Theatre, and the taxi driver said to me, you're going to see Bob Dylan? And I said, he asked me, and I said, and he said, he's dead, isn't he?
Oh, wow.
This was in 1989.
Yeah.
You know, and this was a guy who just read the newspapers and assumed that, I don't know, since Blowing in the Wind, nothing had happened. Yeah.
You're one of the speakers of the conference that we opened at the University of Southern Denmark. And what is your topic?
Well, I just want to try to talk about how it was to encounter all that music when it was new. And to say that it's very different from encountering it now, when it is all available to you in any order you like, with any chronology, and with so many decades of myth already established.
Yeah, so today we can meet the young Dylan, the middle-aged Dylan, and the old man that tours the world
at the
right
same
now.
time.
Yeah,
yes,
and that's
absolutely.
strange.
Yes.
It's a special experience.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's different from when you,
It's
of course,
extremely different.
Yeah.
Because then you had one thing at a time, and it was different from the previous thing, and each time. Because other people didn't change in the way that he did, you know. Other people were the same. And rock and roll people, maybe they mellowed and started singing ballads, but that was the only change anybody made. Or perhaps their voice deteriorated, like, you know, Frank Sinatra's voice in the 60s was not what it had been in the 40s. But basically, people just, they had a sound, and that was them.
Dylan changed a lot.
Dylan changed many, many times.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, year by year.
What is your favorite album? Could I ask you if you could answer that question? Perhaps it's impossible, but nevertheless, I'll try.
Okay, can I have two?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Blonde on Blonde from the 60s and Love and Theft from 2001. In my opinion, the only great album in the 21st century that he has made.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gray. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, it
thank
was
you.
My pleasure.
Tak til vores seere, fordi I kiggede med.